Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a chance to stretch, grab a chai, and take in the thought-provoking sessions from earlier today. My name is Adhya, and I'm a first year majoring in computer science at the University of Texas at Dallas and a member of Hindu YUVA. While we might live in a country that embraces diversity, it's essential to recognize that not every place or person shares the same welcoming spirit. Even if you have never experienced Hinduphobia, that does not mean it isn't very real. Hinduphobia is an issue of manufactured systemic bias, not just personal prejudice. Being a part of this conference means a lot to me because it's about reclaiming narratives and making space for conversations that are often overlooked. We have covered powerful stories in this morning, from media bias and the erasure of Hindu festivals to struggles faced by other indigenous marginalized communities. And we now moved on to our final session, which will examine how institutional frameworks shape perceptions and biases. Our next speaker is Professor Lee Jussim, Distinguished Professor of Psychology at Rutgers University, where he has chaired the Psychology Department and Anthropology Department in the program in Criminal Justice. He has published over 140 articles and chapters and 7 books. His scholarship addresses stereotypes, prejudice, expectancy, effects, and accuracy, and how dysfunctional academic norms in everything from peer reviews to methods to political biases that in the validity of much work produced by the social sciences. And more recently, radicalization in academia and the wider society. His book, Social Perception and Social Reality, contested the psychological canon that social perception was mostly biased and received the American Publishers Award for the best book in psychology in 2012. He is a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance and the Society for Open Inquiry in the Behavioral Sciences, which aspires to be an antidote to the denunciatory censorous turn in academia. He also writes essays in social science and academia in Unsafe Science on Substack. In today's presentation, Instructing Animosity, How DEI Pedagogy Produces the Hostile Attribution Bias, we'll explore how certain diversity, equity, and inclusion programs may unintentionally heighten intergroup tensions and create biases where none previously existed. His work prompts us to critically reflect how educational frameworks intend to foster inclusivity can sometimes yield to opposite effect. Please join me in welcoming Professor Lee Jussim Ji.
Okay, great. Thank you. Am I in? Can you hear me? Just doing a check to make sure everyone can hear me. Uh, I am now worried because I'm not getting a response. Oh, okay. Thank you. Got it. Okay. All right. So in that case, let me get the ball rolling. Thank you for that introduction. I am going to share my screen. Let me make sure you can see my shared screen. Hopefully you can see that. Um, so what I'm going to be talking about is really one of the 3 studies that were part of the report that I've posted up here. Um, uh, uh, the full report is openly available. There's the link up there. I'm happy to share it to anyone who is so interested. Um, After the talk is done, or you can just sort of write it down. You can find it at NCRI reports. Okay, so what we did in these 3 studies was as far as I know, the first attempt to experimentally examine the potential downside negative consequences of certain kinds of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, rhetoric, and pedagogy. So I'm a little, I've taken to calling it unannounced side effects rather than unintended, because if you read the original, when I read the original literature, the literature that we drew on, it seems to me that that although DEI is often billed as this sort of feel good, everybody is welcome, inclusion, celebrate diversity, who could possibly argue with that kind of um, uh, uh, intervention or worldview, or whatever you want to call it, when you read certain of the primary sources, it looks like demonization is absolutely intended. And so if you get that far and reach that conclusion, it's kind of difficult to call it an unintended side effect. It's more like nobody marched into the room announcing, well, we're going to implement DEI by demonizing certain groups. And what I'm going to be focusing on is Hindus. So the three studies, we actually examined anti-racist DEI pedagogy, anti-Islamophobia DEI pedagogy, and anti-caste oppression DEI pedagogy. I'm really only going to, I'm happy to go through the anti-racist and anti-Islamophobia stuff, but I'm going to focus in the talk on the anti-caste oppression stuff. So what we did was we conducted a national survey, 800, almost 850 people. And we extracted text, both quoted directly and slightly massaged in order to create our experimental manipulation. So in our experiment, people were randomly assigned to one of two conditions. In one condition, they received the sort of social justice, anti-caste oppression rhetoric that can be found in what I suspect many of you are at least reasonably familiar with. If not, it's available online. It's also very easy to find. This report by an anti-caste oppression group that calls itself Equality Labs, I would argue is a misnomer also, but that's what they call themselves, and um, and expose people to 3 paragraphs of rhetoric that was taken from this Equality Labs report. So there are 3 paragraphs. I've just extracted one of them here. This isn't even a full paragraph. So even that you can read it, I know she's sort of, you don't read things, but this is just so rich. I'm going to enjoy reading this. I'm going to read it, even though it's right here. Shudras and Dalits are caste oppressed. They experience profound injustices, including socioeconomic hardship and brutal violence at the hands of the upper castes. Dalits live in segregated ghettos, are banned from temples, and are denied access to schools and public amenities. The 25-year-old caste system is enforced by violence and maintained by one of the world's oldest, most persistent cultures. This went on in our experiment. There were 3 paragraphs of this, but that gives you a flavor of what we extracted. Now, we also had a control condition or a comparison condition. And so in the comparison condition, we also wrote about Hindu history and culture for 3 paragraphs. And I'm only going to, again, I'm going to present an excerpt from what we presented. So you can see here the first paragraph extracted here is about Jati and Varna. It kind of describes the history, sort of the meaning of Jati and Varna in Hindu culture. And then it went on to also talk about caste. And what you can see in the second paragraph, it's presented there that Jati and Varna are often confused with caste, and sort of goes on like that. And the idea was for the control essay to mention caste and acknowledge that caste has some pretty nasty issues associated with it, but to frame what was being presented as kind of a neutral historical cultural description of certain aspects of Hindu history and culture, as much as we could do in 3 paragraphs. So people were randomly assigned to either get the Equality Lab's anti-caste oppression rhetoric or this more even-handed, neutral description. Okay, so the question is, how did this influence our participants' beliefs and attitudes? Well, to assess that, we actually gave them, I should have excerpted that, but I didn't, but I can kind of briefly tell you what that is here. We created a scenario where a student had applied for admissions to an elite college. And I'll read the scenario because the whole scenario is incredibly short. That scenario went like this. Raj Kumar applied to an elite East Coast university in fall 2022. During the application process, he was interviewed by an admissions officer, Anand Prakash. Ultimately, Raj's application was rejected. That's the whole scenario. There was nothing else. We counterbalanced it. What that means is some people got Raj as the applicant and Anand as the admissions officer. Other people got Anand as the applicant and Raj as the admissions officer. The names didn't matter at all, so I'm just going to ignore that. Okay. So they got this very brief scenario about someone who applied for admissions. Obviously, they're Indian-sounding names, both of them. But there's no information about anybody's caste or anything. They just got, Raj applied, Anand interviewed him, and he was rejected. What you see here are the results. So we then assessed in a variety of ways how much sort of casteism and unfairness people read into this very neutral scenario. And remember, at elite universities, most people are rejected. I mean, I don't know, they admit 5-10% of the applicants, something like that. So being rejected happens to almost everybody. Okay, so the kinds of questions we asked were things like, how many microaggressions did the applicant experience? How biased was the admissions officer? How much harm did the applicant experience? How biased was the admission officer's decision? And how unfair was the process? And what you can see here is in every case, when people received the Equality Lab's anti-caste oppression DEI type rhetoric, they viewed the admissions officer as more biased, as committing more microaggressions, more biased against lower caste Hindus, committing more harm, and so forth and so on. So this is sort of our first evidence of the sort of demonization effect of this sort of Equality Lab's DEI type rhetoric. We also asked them to evaluate how racist they saw Hindus. And as you can see here on the left, after receiving the equality, the anti-caste oppression, I'm laughing because this is inclusion, right? And so what it's doing, what the rhetoric is doing, is increasing anti-Hindu racism. Okay. It's anti-Hindu racism because they concluded that Hindus were more racist. And then we also asked a series of questions about how much the admissions officer should be punished. And there were a series of questions about punishment. I just summarized them here. There were things like the person should be suspended, should be forced to take a DEI training, students should protest, and so forth and so on. And again, not surprisingly, given that they saw the admissions officer as racist, they also thought they more strongly endorsed some sort of action to punish the admissions officer. What you see here is the relationship between left-wing authoritarianism and willingness to punish. So left-wing authoritarianism is endorsement of things like, censoring offensive speech, support for censoring offensive speech, and stripping the rich of their wealth and belongings, and so forth and so on. Those are the kind of questions assessed by left-wing authoritarianism measures. And the effect's not gigantic, but you can see that the general trend is sloping upward. That is, the people higher in left-wing authoritarianism were also more willing to punish the admissions officer. Now, we looked at whether our experiment actually increased left-wing authoritarianism, and it didn't. So there was no effect on left-wing authoritarianism, but what this means is that even though the people in the prior slides, here's the willingness to punish stuff again, were more willing to punish the admissions officer when they received the anti-caste oppression DEI type rhetoric, even though they didn't necessarily score any higher on left-wing authoritarianism than anybody else, they started acting in a way similar to left-wing authoritarians in the sense that both people who received the Equality Labs rhetoric and people who came in being higher on left-wing authoritarianism were all more willing to punish the admissions officer, basically for just doing his job. Okay. Now, the next thing we did was we asked how much people endorsed basically demonization rhetoric applied to Hindus. And the way we did this was we read through Mein Kampf, Hitler's, the actual Hitler's Mein Kampf. And we extracted sentences and phrases that Hitler applied to Jews. You can see the first one's up there. The Jew was only and always a parasite in the body of other peoples. It goes on like that. And we just flipped out Jews and flipped in Hindus. So we asked them how much they agree with statements like, the Hindu was only and always a parasite in the body of other peoples. The Hindus are a people under whose parasitism the whole of honest humanity is suffering. So there were 3 of these minimally adapted Hitler quotes adapted to refer to Hindus rather than Jews. And what you see here are the difference in agreement with those quotes when they got the Equality Labs essay. So they were 35% more likely to agree that Brahmins are parasites, that Brahmins are a virus, and that Brahmins are the devil personified. So again, so this, as much as anything else, really captures this sort of demonization effect of the Equality Labs type rhetoric. Okay. That's basically the study. We had, as I said, we had 2 more studies that looked at anti-racist rhetoric. We found basically the same pattern. And then we looked at anti-Islamophobia, the DEI type rhetoric, and got basically the same pattern. So I think that's, I think I can stop there. I'll stop there and take questions at this point. I'm going to stop the share, though I'm happy to put stuff back up if you have questions about anything in particular. Yeah, I guess I'm happy to moderate. I mean, I see one hand up by Kumu Gupta. So Kumu, you have the floor.
Would you mind talking about how the media tried to silence these topics?
Yeah, so sure. I am a little bit uncomfortable. I realized there was a lot of rhetoric. Okay, so when we first posted the studies on the NCRI website, we were in touch with reporters from the New York Times and Bloomberg News who were considering doing stories on it. And ultimately, they decided not to do those stories. It was eventually covered first by the National Review, then by a slew of other places, including the Chronicle of Higher Education and the Times of London. And tons of other places also. And a lot of the rhetoric was that the Times and Bloomberg News, sort of tried to suppress the story. And I'm not sure that's possible. It is possible that they just didn't want to, they saw it as a hot potato or too controversial, and they decided to nix their coverage of the studies. But I don't really know that. Mainstream news outlets have lots of reasons for not running particular stories. They might have decided it was too preliminary. I mean, the stuff at this point is a non-peer-reviewed report that appears on the NCRI website. We are currently working on it now to prepare it for submission to a peer-reviewed journal. But it wasn't it hasn't been peer-reviewed yet. It wasn't peer-reviewed when we were in touch with them. That was one of the reasons the Times gave us for not running with it, although they have run with stories by NCRI that weren't peer-reviewed prior to this. So we don't know what to make of that. And maybe it was suppression, but they might have, it's also possible they could have decided the studies weren't definitive enough. The New York Times had not long before this came out run with a very long expose of the dysfunctional nature of DEI at the University of Michigan. So maybe they decided they kind of just published a piece that was critical of DEI, and maybe they just didn't want to go with another one so quickly after having published that one. So I don't know if the rhetoric around suppression is actually true. It's possible that it was true, but I can't say I know that or even believe that I definitely believe that it's possible, but I can't even say I think it was likely. So that's my view on the media suppression angle. And it did end up getting lots of coverage from lots of mainstream outlets. I mean, the first one was the National Review. They're sort of a very conventional conservative outlet. Maybe it's not. I mean, conservatives have been critical of DEI for years, so it's not really surprising that they decided to run with it. But then it was covered by lots of outlets that either lean left or don't have a lean at all. So I don't know. I'm a little forgiving on things like this. It might have been some sort of bias on their part, but I would give them the benefit of the doubt.
Thank you, Professor Lee Jussim, for that insightful presentation. So this format does not include questions, but your research challenges us to think critically about the narratives that shape institutional policies and how well-intentioned frameworks can sometimes carry unintended consequences. As you reflect on these findings, it's important to consider how Hinduphobia, like other forms of bias, can be reinforced within systems designed to promote equity. We will continue to explore these intersections in the next presentations, but let's take a moment to appreciate how Professor Jussim's work calls us to engage in thoughtful and data-driven approaches to combating bias.